you just go and they get you when they get you. So I got my booster not at 2, but at 3. And I thought it might have been 3:30 or 4.
I got mine last week. I'm
Oh,
very glad.
good. Yeah. So we just traveled this past weekend, and ideally I would have gotten it before we traveled, but my wife was like, "Don't get it the day before we travel, because if you feel cruddy, that's a bummer." So that's why I waited. Yeah. Okay. Well, we have a nice crowd. We typically have a few more, but so we'll see if some people roll in. Professor Matthews, bear with some announcements just for a few minutes because we have a busy next 4 days or 5 days, and once we get through those, we'll get rolling. And I know that when we get rolling, do you want me to set it up a little, or do you want to just start with some of the demos that we talked about at the beginning?
How about I start with a couple of demonstrations, and then you can share, how you came to be interested in this topic.
Perfect. Okay, just wanted to, and we had talked about that via email. So that's my favorite thing that I do to people is I'm like, how about we just don't do the thing I said we'd do? Okay, so that sounds great. So I'm gonna ask. Let's see. I see 3 officers on my screen. So how about each of them does one? So, and I think more of them are here actually, but I'm seeing Emily, Marion, and Safa. So Emily, let's work backwards. Can you remind people about Monday?
Yes, so on Monday, there's going to be the food drive. I believe that starts at 3:30, but I'd have to double check on that one. Oh, it starts at 2:45 and it's until 5 p.m. And you can still sign up there. So basically, we would travel over to Rolling Meadows High School. Then we'd help pack up the food and then into a truck, and then we would follow that truck to food pantry, and then we'd help unload it there. If you have any questions, feel free to chat me about that. We can get you connected for that.
Nailed it. We have, I think, 9 people sign up now, which is great and is about right what we were hoping to get, but we could always use more. And not to twist your arms, but it's a great sort of like, hey, it's Thanksgiving, and that kind of thing. The giving, put the giving in Thanksgiving. So, Safa, can you talk a little bit about Saturday?
So
and I'm going to have Marion help you too because of the directions issue. But yeah.
Yeah, sure. So on Saturday, as you guys know, the Honors has these outings that we go on that are super great because we all get to hang out, go out for these outings, and they're usually really, really interesting places that you wouldn't probably maybe go to otherwise. So this Saturday, it's the Deer Grove Forest Preserve, and I know that we have a few people signed up already, but you can still sign up, and all you need to do is sign up on the Google Doc. You don't need if you haven't been to any other events, then you do need to do the waiver and be cleared for Harper, and show proof of your vaccination or a negative COVID test. And those things can really only take about a day if you get to it now. So if you guys want to sign up, the Google Doc sheet should be the second announcement on the Honors page. So if you guys are interested, you can check it out.
One little clarification. We would love you guys to, yes, do it. The waiver, the travel waiver part, we still do want. It's just the other part about the vaccines. If you're good, you're good. You don't have to do that every time you go on an outing, unless you're doing it through testing, right? So if you're vaccinated, we have that info. But if you're doing it through testing, then you need to show us that you're cleared. What is good, though, if any of you are a little bit worried for safety point of view, both Monday and Saturday are outside. So it makes it a little bit more comfortable that way. And the next thing was Marion's idea. So I wanted to save this for you, Marion. Marion's also going to be point person on Saturday. You're going Saturday, right, Marion?
Yeah, I'm going, and To get there, it's a little confusing. It took us a little bit of time to get there. So I do have a pamphlet that they gave us that gives you exactly where to park. So I'll make sure to add that to the document wherever you signed up. So if you want to, after the meeting, go back to that document and there should be a picture of where you should specifically go.
Awesome.
So there's that with the Forest Preserve. And then this Friday, we are doing a tie-dye mask / Friendsgiving. And with that, we are going to be tie-dyeing a bunch of masks. And there'll be children masks, and we will give them to a local elementary school. Because, kids aren't exactly able to get vaccinated, but they still have to wear masks. And, sometimes kids lose theirs or gets them dirty, and it just helps them to have extra masks around. So that was the idea of the project. And after all of our hard work with tie-dye and the masks, we will be providing food. I think it's like sandwiches, and there's also dietary options for other people. But yeah, and then we'll just have fun and talk about what people are doing for Thanksgiving. So that's the plan.
Only 4 spots left, I think.
Should be super fun. I just signed up. So, and Timasian will be there too. So, but I don't think it's signed up yet. We will be gone for kind of the second half though, because we have our honors and PTK committee meeting. So we'll just be with you all at the beginning. Groovy. And the last thing, I just want to put a plug in. I don't know if any of the officers just want to throw their email in there in the chat. You don't need to, but we are the officer group is trying to think about the spring and different ideas for outings and different ideas for speakers and things like this. So if any of you have suggestions, you could always send them to Timasian or I, but we'd like to do a better job empowering the officers. So you can send it to the officers as well. So I don't know if any of you want to throw your email in there, you can follow up directly with the officers about ideas you have. Groovy? Groovy. Okay. So I am not going to ruin everything by just starting to talk a lot. I am only going to say this, that our guest speaker today is Professor Matthews from psychology. She is the wonderful teacher of Psych 101 right now, and she's doing such a great job that Psych 228 in the spring filled just like that. So, and Kirsten, we can raise the cap a few seats if you want, but otherwise it was very exciting to see that so popular right out of the gates. So that's great. So I'm glad that class is looking strong, and I'm sure you're all very excited to have Professor Matthews in the spring. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Professor Matthews because she's going to do some demonstrations before we do other stuff.
Okay.
Oh, and I'm going to do this. Yay! Yeah.
So it's good to see all of you. Some of you are current students, others are former students. At least one of you is a current and former student. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 3 little demonstrations, and that'll kind of lead us into the topic that we're going to do today. If you are a current or former student and you remember these demonstrations, then just don't say anything right away, and then we can talk about it. Okay, so the first one involves a really quick little video, I think it's like 20 seconds or something. And as you're watching, it's going to be a little basketball game. As you're watching, I want you to count the number of passes that the team in white makes, okay? So count the number of passes that the team in white makes. And I saw at least one of you smile, so you watched my video and remember this. Okay, hold on one second.
Everyone, you're going to want to mute yourselves, everyone, so this doesn't create feedback.
Okay, so I'm going to play it now. Again, count the number of passes that the team in white makes. Okay. Does anybody have a guess? Just unmute yourself or throw it in the chat. I can't actually see the chat. Oh, there's, okay, I'm seeing some of you. Yeah, hold on one. Well, I don't know where the chat is from this screen. And I'm not going to undo it, but I'm guessing that most of you said about 13. Actually, I am going to unshare it.
We had 13, 14, and 12 in the chat.
13, 14, and 12. Okay, did anybody notice anything surprising? It is 13, but did anybody notice anything else you wanted to comment on?
Mm-hmm.
Any of my students who remember what you maybe didn't notice the first time? Did you see anything unusual in there?
Oh, geez, I don't know.
Okay, so down in your little emoji thing, give me a thumbs up if you saw a moonwalking bear that goes straight through the center of the...
What?
Okay, so nobody saw the moonwalking bear. Okay, so I'm going to share again, and it's going to show you the whole thing. This time, don't count. Just watch and see if you can see the moonwalking bear.
Get out of this.
Okay. Okay. It went all the way across the screen there, but then got covered up by advertisements. Okay, yeah, so there was a moonwalking bear there, and it looks like most of you did not see that. So this is telling us that our perception is limited. We might call this selective attention. We notice some things, we don't notice other things. And attention is that first step in the direction of memory. So later, you're forming a memory of that video. You don't have any memory of the moonwalking bear because you didn't notice it at the first time, okay? Also, we see what we expect to see. So we don't necessarily see what is there in the world. We often are biased to see things that are based on our previous experience and our expectations, okay? So our perception is one limitation. I'm going to do another little demonstration, this one I don't need to share my screen. I'm going to read a word list, and I want you to listen to the list and don't write anything down while I'm reading it, because if you do, you'll get 100%, and that's not the point. So listen to the word list, and then when I'm done, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Or actually, when I'm done, then you're going to write down everything you can remember, and then I'll ask you a few questions. All right, so here's the list. Thread, pin, eye, sewing, sharp, point, prick, thimble, haystack, thorn, hurt, injection, syringe, cloth, knitting. Okay, write down all the words that you can remember. Take a few more seconds. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a few questions, and in the emojis, just give me a thumbs up if you recall the words that I mentioned. Okay, so the first word is thread. If you recalled the word thread, then give me a thumbs up emoji. Like a lot of you remembered thread. What about knitting? Give me a thumbs up if you recalled knitting. some of you. What about point? And what about needle? The thumbs up if you recall the word needle. Okay, so the word needle was not in the list at all. And I saw some of you who may remember this from class smiling when you heard the list, but the word needle is not in there. So a whole bunch of you had a false memory. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that not only would many of you remember the wrong word, like a word that just wasn't there, but that all of you would remember the same wrong word? What do you think? Jacob.
Isn't it because information can be added or incorrect during the encoding process?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what do you think was making this particular encoding wrong? What do you think was getting in the way? Like, why would you remember the word needle and not the word dog or something like that?
I guess it's because there are words in that list that might have been associated with needle.
Yeah, every single word on the list is related to needle. So if you think about all of these words being, I don't know, I kind of picture them like on a big fishing net or something all clipped onto the net. And if you pull on all the words that were in the list and the word needle is clipped onto the net, but you didn't hear it, you're not pulling it up, it just sort of gets pulled along for the ride, you know? So it's like you're pulling up on all these other words, it just kind of goes along. So it's through association, okay? And what this is doing, it's revealing not only is memory imperfect, we have false memories, but memory is not a video recording. So I already said that our perception is limited and it's biased by our expectations, but it's also, our memory is limited, also biased by our previous knowledge, our expectations, and it's limited in so many other ways. We can not only remember like little false pieces of information, we can remember entire events that never happened. There's a researcher named Elizabeth Loftus who was kind of the original person to do this work, who was able to implant entire memories into her college student participants about going to Disney World and being lost in a shopping mall and all of these other kinds of things that would be emotional. Like you'd think that you would really remember something like that, and if it happened, but not remember it if it didn't. So our memory is limited, so we can't rely on our perception, we can't rely on our memory. And I know I want to do one more, and I'm going to share my screen to show you a picture here. But once I show you the picture, I'll take it down, and then you can let me know what you think. So give me just 1 second. Okay, so imagine you're in a room, and there are 2 strings that are hanging down from the ceiling. And you're in there all by yourself with a table and, like a pair of pliers or something. Your task is to tie those 2 strings together. All right. So you grab one string and you reach over for the other string and you can't reach it. So what do you do? Okay, so here you are. Here's the 2 strings. You have a table, you have pliers. I'm going to stop sharing. How might you solve that problem?
I'm fascinated.
I see Emily.
Could you use the pliers to snip off the strings and then tie them like on the table? Like, does it still have to be attached to the ceiling?
That is an excellent and creative idea. So basically snip off the strings and then tie them if your task was to tie them. Okay, well, the task is actually to leave them attached and tie them. But if you didn't say that, right, that's a really creative way to solve the problem. So you're thinking outside the box. So if we do leave them attached, does anybody have an idea how to solve that?
Future engineer, Emily. Nice with that. I like that. Outside the box.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, you can kind of imagine yourself like grabbing one and then like trying to go over to the other side to reach for the other one, and then you can't, so you drop the first one and you grab the second one, and then you walk over to the other side and try to grab the first one. And
Oh.
yeah, John.
Well, I was just going to ask, like, it looks like if I swung them, they'd get closer together. So I didn't know if I could, like, bring the table over the middle so I was higher so that they were closer together than when they arced, and then swing one and then swing the other and wait for them to come closer together.
Okay, so there's two pieces to that. One is move the table so you're in between. So maybe standing on the table would make you higher. Would that help? You know, a lot of you would probably try that, and it actually doesn't. So then you might think, well, can you swing them? And they're very lightweight, so swinging moves them a little bit. But that's actually a good line of thought. Any thoughts related to swinging them?
What if you attach the plier to one end and then put it into motion with the other string, and then when it comes back?
That's exactly right. You take the pliers, you tie them to one side, and you create a pendulum. Because now instead of just swinging a little bit, it'll swing a whole lot. And so then you get it going, grab one, and bring it back together. That's exactly right. This is a hard task. I was actually, when I was in college, I participated in somebody's honors thesis, and this is what they did. They put me in the room by myself, and I walked around, I stood on the table, you know, all of those kinds of things, and eventually figured out how to solve it. But it's a hard task, and a lot of times people don't figure it out. And what it's showing is another limitation in our thinking called functional fixedness, meaning if you know how to use things in your everyday world, it's really hard to think outside the box, right? So, you know, you might have thought of using the pliers to maybe snip something which is a little closer to their use, or you might have thought about, you know, doing things that kind of stayed a little near what those things would do, even grabbing and kind of pulling over. But, you know, turning something into a pendulum really has to push you outside the box. And the functional fixedness is a bias, like other biases, that are helpful in our everyday lives because it helps us solve problems quickly. But the problem is we sometimes can't solve problems. Like our minds get stuck, and then we end up not being able to solve novel problems. And sometimes we can be really wrong with some other biases as well. So I just wanted to start with those three little tasks to demonstrate that we are not always rational thinkers. And this is sort of why we need science in psychology. So psychology is a science. It is based on the scientific method. I know many of you are in different sciences, but the scientific method requires us to use a set of methods that allow us to step outside of ourselves a little bit and have more objectivity. We can't be perfect because scientists are humans, right? And humans have biases. And so even scientists have biased thinking. And so the scientific method is one way to help rein in that bias a little bit, because our beliefs can be wrong. And confidence does not equal accuracy. All of you have probably had the experience where you felt like you did awesome on an exam, and then you didn't. You know, like you were really, really, really confident. You thought you knew everything, but you didn't. The popularity of an idea does not mean it's accurate. I mean, people really, really believed that the Earth was flat for a very long time, and that didn't make it true. Although I hear that there are still people who believe that. And then we have a whole bunch of different cognitive biases, and I kind of moved us in the direction to thinking about those, but there's a whole bunch of them. And as we kind of move through today, we can bring up different ones and how they might show up in different real world examples. But any questions before John kind of shares why he approached me about sharing this topic? All right, John.
So it is only a mild exaggeration for me to say that this topic, for me, was born out of an existential crisis because, you know, when you study philosophy, and I'm a big fan of the philosopher Plato, Plato sort of takes the view that, like, if you want to become more virtuous, you know, you want to be a good person, you talk about what it is to be a good person, and you think about it, and the more you think and the more you know, sort of devote conscious energy, that sort of is what's going to guide you to figure out, you know, how to live. In other words, philosophy sort of works on this assumption that we choose our paths in life because we think about them rationally. We have our political views because we've sort of weighed them and we think rationally about them. And so all of, you know, it sort of has this idea that we're very free to craft ourselves as human beings. We do so consciously, and then the product comes from all that. And then I listen to these podcasts, and some of my favorites are, you know, Radio Lab and Hidden Brain is a social science podcast. And the more I listened to them, the more I started to feel like, oh no, it's a lie. All the reasons I think I believe something are not true. It's all because of stuff that's like I don't even know is there. And so all these cognitive biases we have, and it made me freak out. And so we wanted to have a conversation about this idea of the rational versus the irrational. And so what I want to do is I want to ask you guys a question. So I think there are some things where we think other people are acting irrationally out of deeply held biases, right? And you can kind of pick your topic, but, you know, some people have some very seriously and sincerely held beliefs about the vaccine and are anti-vaccine. And others of you might think like that is nonsense. These are beliefs based on nonsense. And so you have no rational basis for this belief. And we think like those are irrational people, but not me. So this is what I want to ask you guys to start the conversation and bring Professor Matthews back in. How widespread do you think the issue of being irrational is? Is it the uneducated? Is it a few people about a very few issues? Or do you think it is a sickness with which we are all afflicted? And in fact, the belief that it doesn't afflict us is part of the disease. So what say you all? Donna?
So I think that, like, when we say that something is irrational, like it's like that's our opinion because, well, yes, there is some. Well, actually, I don't know. Now that I'm talking, I don't know if I agree with what I'm saying anymore. But what I was gonna say was that, like, yes, there is science, but then lots of like what's right and wrong or what's rational or irrational is like objective and it's subject to like people's opinion. So, so yeah, like so to answer the question, okay, yeah, I'm just gonna stop there. So yeah.
Okay. I love what you said. I think, Donna, I kind of want to agree and disagree with it, right? In one sense, I think we use the word irrational to refer to people with whom we disagree. So we just say like, I think you're wrong and therefore your view is irrational. But I think there's another way to think of the word irrational, which is like there is, and Professor Matthews, maybe help us out with this, like presumably there is sort of a definition of irrational so that there are objective criteria for knowing if a belief is in fact, you know, I can think of two ways of thinking about this. One is unconscious and that kind of, you know, you have a belief and you're not even aware of it or something like that. But then there's the other, which seems like it's, I don't know, how would I define it? Not based on evidence? I don't know. So is there a way to define irrationality?
Well, I don't know, like off the top of my head, a specific definition, but what I can say is that just in general in science, the idea is that you want to rely on evidence, okay? And especially in the social sciences, but in any of the sciences, you might have different kinds of evidence that might even conflict. Sometimes they really conflict. Sometimes they look like they conflict, but if you actually put them together in the right way, you see that they don't really conflict. But the idea is that you are relying on evidence. And part of being rational is about the process too, because we have evidence and in science, evidence changes. And as we learn more, then we realized that what we thought we knew before was rational because it was based on the evidence, but now we know more. And so we need to adjust our thinking to meet the new evidence. I think the vaccines are an excellent example of that, right? Or the pandemic in general, like we started off having no information really about this particular virus, about what it does in the world, all of that kind of stuff. But then, so there were the initial recommendations. And then as we learned more, those recommendations changed. The rational thing to do is say, okay, we now know more, so we need to change our thinking. Whereas the irrational thing to do would be, but you said, you told me, whatever it was, and I'm going to stick with that. That's called anchoring. That's another cognitive bias, is we want to go with what we heard first. So if you still hear people, there's still a lot of debates and challenging issues related to the pandemic and to vaccines. But if somebody's arguing arguments that came out 2 years ago and clinging to those, even if further evidence has challenged those particular arguments, then that would not be rational. That's called anchoring, sticking to the first thing that you learned and believed and not being able to let it go. Like it's holding you like an anchor. Okay.
So can I ask you a question, Professor Matthews? So I think we think of like being trained into a scientific way of thinking, and typically we think of that in the physical sciences, right? Where it's like, well, we test a hypothesis. So it's like a set of skills that you develop. Do you think, I guess I'm asking everyone, do you all think that we all think that like being rational and guided by evidence is just kind of like natural? Like, well, I'm a human being, so of course I am. And that it's, or do you think like, actually, no, most people don't do it and can't do it unless they like really work on it? Like, how natural is it, do you think, to be rational? And how much of it is like, no, you have to like, that is a hard skill to learn?
Well, I don't think learning how to be rational is necessarily hard. It takes a lot of work and time. And I also think that anybody can be both rational and irrational in some ways.
Okay. Who else? You think it comes natural? Soft, that sounds like, it looks like you're about to talk.
Well, because I'm trying to make sure that I'm saying something that makes sense before I say it. But like Donna was saying earlier, some people justify their rationality based on their prior experiences and what they define a rational reason to be. Or I guess I'm using rationality interchangeably with justifications, like how you justify why you did something or why you feel a certain way. So to me, when I'm thinking about the vaccine, like let's say someone's rational decision for not getting the vaccine has something to do with like religion, but it's misinformed, but to them it's a legitimate justification because they're coming from this rational background based on their religious values, even though it's misinformed.
Mm. Okay.
Yeah, well, you can think about being rational, as I said, like a process, right? It's about the tools that you're using. And so, if the content that you're acting on is flawed, you can still be acting on it in a way that is rational. So I think that's kind of what you're saying. And I think another example of that, and actually maybe even getting really at the issue of being rational, even when you're doing something that seems irrational. Not religion, but race is a big thing in terms of vaccine hesitancy. And so if you think specifically about the African American community being hesitant, more hesitant on average than some of the other groups, that is rational. That is very rational based on the history that group has experienced in terms of treatment by the medical establishment. And not only in history. So I know in my class, we talk about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments and stuff where people were studied without informed consent. They were allowed to die over time from a disease that could have been treated, and they were not given treatment, right? That's part of the history of that group, but there's also real lived experiences that people have in the present. It's not just the history. And so if somebody's like, you want to stick me and put something in my body, and I don't trust you, and I don't trust the community, the medical community, then that can be a rational position, even if ultimately that rational position is missing some of the information that might change the outcome. Okay, so sometimes we behave in ways that are rational, using all the various kinds of evidence we have, even if, even if the outcome ultimately is not the best outcome. And so then that means that in terms of persuasion, you have to target the message appropriately to the particular audience, because we respond differently to different messages. And so you're trying to target people, and I'll use climate change as an example. If you're trying to target people with information about climate change, then it really matters how you're doing it. There's been research that shows that Pope Francis made a huge impact on people who are Catholic in terms of their beliefs on climate change, because he took a moral stance in his persuasion, whereas conservatives, who traditionally don't talk a lot about climate change, are more persuaded by things like the free market and focusing on being able to make your own choices and fiscal sorts of issues, right? Totally different paths toward getting somebody to make a choice about something. But the audience matters. The way you share that information matters.
Professor Matthews, so if I'm hearing you right, that's super interesting, because what kinds of information you would tailor it depending on the target audience. And tell me if this is totally wrong, but I thought I heard somewhere recently that when it comes to some of these things, that actually for some people, the more information you provide, the more, so it doesn't help them overcome a desire to reject it. It actually makes them even more rejecting, that they actually no, anyone who works that hard.
Yes. Yeah, so what I was describing here was about targeting a message using the language that you respond to. But yeah, the quantity of information, there's actually two different biases that I can mention there. So what you're talking about is called the Backfire Effect, meaning that when your core beliefs are challenged, you start to believe them even more strongly. So you get more information and you cling to your ideas even more strongly. There's also something called the Dunning-Kruger Effect, which is those without expertise are actually more confident in their beliefs than those with expertise. So in a rational way, the more we know about something, the more we realize we don't know, and the more we're willing to kind of step back and not try to tell everybody that they're wrong. So those are two different ones that kind of tie to what you're talking about. But yeah, the more information we get, the more we can push back. There's another one actually related to that called reactance. Reactance is going to be doing the opposite of what somebody wants you to do. And so the harder somebody pushes, the more information they give you, the more you push back. All of those are present related to vaccine hesitancy, right? So the more information you're given, the more you're told to do something, the more people will push back against that. And, a lot of times, especially on social media, the people who know less information are the ones who are speaking the loudest and putting the information out there.
So and Nancy, you're going to like this. One of the things that motivated me thinking about you and about this and everything is this idea that it's actually our psychological commitments are much more powerful than our intellectual commitments. And so the example that comes to mind for me, and Nan has talked to me a lot about vegetarianism over the years. And when I teach ethics, one of the fascinating things in ethics is if two people are on opposite sides of the abortion debate, that is a completely friendly conversation in class, which in a way is astonishing, right? Because if you believe someone is severely curtailing the rights of women and someone else believes that you are sanctioning infanticide, you ought to be about as hot in opposite directions as you could be, right? That you have really radical contradictory views. People get along fine. You bring up arguments in favor of vegetarianism to a bunch of meat eaters, people lose their minds. And so my suspicion is that it is simply because you don't want to feel like a bad person. And so then we like backfill a whole bunch of nonsense justifications for why something is okay. But the only thing that's really happening is we are so psychologically committed to not feeling bad about who we are as human beings that we will do anything to preserve that. And is that like a cognitive bias? How would you, okay.
Yeah, there's two terms I would give to that. One of them is just the emotional piece. And it's sometimes called an affect heuristic. Like a heuristic is a mental shortcut. We will prioritize emotion over intellect. A lot of times we get really tied to the emotional stuff. But another one is cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is when there are two views and they're in conflict, and you're aware of that conflict. And vegetarianism is a great example of that because, you know, for somebody who understands the environmental issues and understands the ethical issues and the health issues and so forth, but yet really, really loves meat and has always eaten meat, and it's part of their family and it's part of their cultural holiday traditions and all of that kind of stuff. So you've got, on the one hand, one set of ideas, and then on the other hand, another set of ideas. They're dissonant, they're in conflict. And so we don't exist well in conflict. And so then we choose one side, but then we have to defend that side because there was some level of conflict. And once we choose, then we start really distancing ourselves from those other ideas. But yeah, cognitive dissonance is the term for that. But also just the idea that we, in general, will really prioritize emotion, even when it's not rational to do that.
So I want to ask all you guys that original question again, then. Do you think we're all guilty of that a lot? That we like, I used to make this joke in an attempt to be a little bit of a smart aleck that like when Professor Matthews and Tamasia and I were growing up, there were the lot of campaigns against tuna because dolphins got caught up in the tuna net. And I always was like, if I was a tuna, I'd be like, well, that's bullshit that they only, like, they're also catching a lot of us in the net. That's not cool. But like, dolphins are cute and therefore we care. And tuna's not cute, so we don't care. And like, that's it. That's all the logic there is like, this thing is cute. And then we back explain everything. Mm-hmm. So do you, any of you feel like, oh, snap, I do that? And then I want to stop talking and turn this back to Professor Matthews.
Dolphins are also mammals, which, I mean, I know we kill mammals for food, but, well, okay, I'll shut up.
Well, I mean, I've heard the argument that dolphins should be persons. They're that developed cognitively.
Dolphins we think of as incredibly intelligent mammals, and so I think we think a little differently about it. But then again, supposedly pigs are very intelligent too.
But like a few years ago, there was found to be some horse meat in some Burger King stuff. People lost their minds. What's the difference between a horse meat and cow meat? Like, we just have a series of associations. It's just associations that is the difference between them. They're like, we think one's crazy to eat and the other we eat like a lot of.
Yeah, and those associations are cultural as well, because different cultures are used to eating particular types of meat and not other types of meat. And so they don't even think about it. So, the term that we would use in psychology is just conditioning. So it's forming those associations and desensitizing. You become desensitized when you do something a lot. And so it loses its emotional value. And in fact, if we think about mental health and we think about fears and other sorts of emotional things that we want to get rid of, one of the ways we do that is by desensitizing ourselves, by doing it over and over. In the same way, you know, in your example, somebody might eat a particular type of meat over and over and just not think about it anymore. But if you talk about, in the United States, talk about eating horses or dolphins, people don't do that. And so they haven't been desensitized to that. It's still fresh, it's still new, it still evokes a response. And then people get frustrated and confused when you say, well, why would you eat a cow but not a horse, right? Because they both have 4 legs, they both live on farms, you know, why one, why not, and not the other? But it's experience that influences that. And then, as you said, you know, we justify, you know, we start off with our beliefs and then we justify our beliefs using whatever tools we have.
Should that bum us out, or is that or like how should we feel about the fact that we have all these cognitive biases? Like what, like Diego says it's up to us. I suppose that's good.
Well, I will give you an example of something that's connected to like social justice and like thinking about the social world, social cognition. We have implicit biases. So we don't even have to have the kinds of cognitive errors that we notice. They can be errors that we don't even notice, right? They can be existing below the surface, influencing our behavior, and they're just out of our awareness. And one of the things that I talk about in my class is that, first of all, it's important to acknowledge that we have these biases, because a lot of times we want to say, well, my memory's perfect, or of course I'm rational, you know, and we're resistant to the idea that the human mind is biased. So first we need to acknowledge those biases, but then second, that doesn't get us off the hook entirely, right? So like if somebody has implicit bias related to race, for example, then that's related to a lot of things that are built into us from evolution in terms of how we put information together. Not the details, not about specific races or anything, but the idea that we put things into categories and that our minds want to be fast. They want to process information in ways that keep us alive and things like that. So it uses these mental shortcuts. That's natural. That's not something to judge. But once you're aware that you're doing something, you can then look at it and be like, I don't agree with that. And then put in conscious effort to kind of change the information that is being acted on by those biases, if that makes sense. Like we have a prefrontal cortex, right? So we have deeper parts of our brain that are making us act quickly and in ways that are not necessarily rational in the moment, but we do have a prefrontal cortex that allows us to slow down, think critically, think about whether we like or don't like information that we discovered is sort of operating automatically, and then try to change out that information. And it takes time, it takes effort. You know, simply deciding, oh, well, I like people regardless of races. I'm not racist, right? That doesn't do the work that it takes to kind of restructure some of what's going on mentally. So the biases are there. You can't get rid of the idea that our mind wants to be quick, it wants to be efficient, but you can change the information that those efficiency tendencies are acting on, I guess. And then constantly slow yourself down and think about it and notice and acknowledge when you've noticed that you've made errors in your thinking. People don't like to do that.
I don't see any of my English 101 people here, but we were talking about implicit bias. We were reading The New Jim Crow this past week. And we were talking about, there's nobody here from another class where we've done that either. But we were talking about how when people do the study on identifying who they think is a perpetrator in like the video game, that people say, well, you know, I can't be racist. Like my spouse is black, like my kids are black, and still the studies show they were. And then even people who are black were still like, they were shocked that they like, you know, still they had implicit biases, racial biases about who the armed offender would be in like the video game. Like that's how ingrained it is.
Yeah, 'cause we absorb it from culture, right? So that information is in there. And every time we are exposed to something in our surroundings immediately or in our broader culture, we don't have to be consciously aware of it, but it gets filed away. And the more of that happens, the stronger that information becomes and the more it influences our thinking, including thinking about ourselves if we're members of a particular group. And so again, it's a great example of highlighting this distinction between implicit processes, which are outside of awareness, and explicit processes, which are the ones we're consciously aware of. Like somebody may not be consciously biased, they may have egalitarian views, and yet that may influence in ways they're not aware of who they interact with, how they interact with them, and how they remember information in the world. Okay, and that, you know, if you live in the United States, then you have some ideas about how there are biases in the court system, you know, and that influences eyewitness testimony. So somebody could actually be watching a crime and see a crime happen, but they don't process the skin color, like it just wasn't visible. Like maybe somebody had on a mask or something and they didn't see skin color, but later they may remember a skin color, right? Because their mind, all of that information that's stored has slipped in information. So it might be somebody who is consciously not racist, and yet at an unconscious level, all of that information is sitting around for fast processing, and then it slips in information that was actually absent. Okay, so it's there can be some pretty damaging effects of implicit bias, and that's why it's important just to pay attention and try to notice it, regardless of what that implicit bias might be about. I think of race in that example, but it doesn't have to be race. It could be age, it could be religion, it could be political party, right? It could be any sort of other group, because our brains, again, like to be efficient, and they divide the world into in-group and out-group. We can't change the fact.
I just wanted to connect what Professor Matthews was saying to our conversation about Disney about a month ago, where everybody was talking about, you know, how Disney like remade, and now here are the films that are more PC, more acceptable. And people kept missing that even in the remakes, remake after remake, a middle-aged or older woman was always evil and always out to get the younger woman. Like there were no examples where an older woman was benevolent at all, right? And I'm like, but the good news is still the older woman's out to get her. Like no one had even, it's so, no one, and people are like, oh yeah, I guess that's right. I'm like, yeah, like pay attention, you know, that's so ingrained, I think, in our society that we just take it for granted.
Yeah, the more common something is, the less we notice it. Like a fish doesn't have to notice the water it's swimming in, right? So the more something is all encompassing, the more it's just how things are, and the less critical we are about it. We notice things when they violate our expectations. We don't notice things when they are consistent with our expectations.
I'm totally struck by your comment about evolution. I find, because it makes sense, right? That like from an evolutionary perspective, you're like, lions are dangerous. I don't need to get to know individual lions. I'm going to operate on the assumption that they're dangerous. But then we import that into cultural attitudes that we don't even aware of. And we think that it's like the same thing. Like, well, these people are dangerous, and I should just err on the side of thinking that they're dangerous rather than getting to know them all, which is crazy, right? But we don't even realize that we've made this enormous leap from like an evolutionary instinct that makes sense to just a cultural prejudice that we like don't even realize that we're committing or something.
Yeah, and there's actually another step to that as well, which is that if you think about how we evolved in small groups. We evolved in tribes who were sort of competing with each other for resources, right? And so even if you're just talking about humans, the idea of being wary of the other, right, is something that would have been evolutionarily adaptive. But there are limits, like any system of efficiency is trying to balance speed and accuracy. But the faster you are, the less accurate you are. And then if you slow down, you're more accurate, but you're slower. And so we're always trying to find that balance. And in doing so, the speed helps us in some situations, but it causes a lot of problems in other situations. And so, we've inherited what psychologists sometimes talk about is we've inherited Stone Age brains. Our brains evolved in a different place for different reasons. And we still have some of those tendencies which made sense where they came from, but they don't make so much sense now. But yeah, and in terms of evolution, that actually ties also to one of the reasons that people have a hard time thinking about climate change, because we were evolved to pay attention to things that were personal, that were abrupt changes, not long-term changes, but things that we actually see the change, things that were immoral, so things that really cause the emotions of disgust or other kinds of emotions, right? And things that are happening now, not in the future. And so those are our Stone Age brains. And then when we have to think about something like climate change, the way our brains are working, it's like it's this uphill battle because we have these strong biases that are not helpful for thinking about something that is sort of this slow-moving, long-term sort of problem that is involving people that we don't know. And the Stone Age brains can present problems.
So Safa and Jacob, I can see you guys, so I want to ask you this question. And this is probably a false choice, but I'm just curious what you think about this, and for Professor Matthews too. I'm wondering if you think that the goal should be then to try to be as rational as possible and work on it, or if a better goal is to admit that we are less rational than we think. Like having humility about our rationality is actually like just as valuable as trying to eliminate irrationality. Like, what do you think is more important? And I'll throw a third one in. And how important is it to, by admitting that we're not necessarily rational, maybe be able to think the other person is maybe more rational than I'm giving them credit for? Because maybe we're both like just animals that like pandas, and like we're just pretending that I'm better than you.
But can I ask, Professor Garcia, then do you think people who'd be like, well, that's just my opinion. That's my opinion. You can have your opinion. Is it that, or is that something different?
I think it's different. That's a whole nother thing. I think the whole, Donna talked about this a little bit earlier. Like we sort of dismiss things as irrational just because we disagree. Right. And then we're like, that's like the ultimate sign of I'm not playing, right? When you're just like, well, I'm entitled to my opinion. I'm like, well, you're kind of not. If your opinion is that the earth is flat, you're just not like, I guess you can believe it, but it's not like okay to believe it. Right. It's a kind of an idiotic phrase, actually, that you're entitled to your own opinion, because I don't know what that means. If like you're entitled to the opinion that you can murder people in a park, like no way are you actually entitled to that opinion. So yeah, so Sapa, Jacob, or whoever can play. What do you think? If you how should we fix this mortal flaw of ours?
Jacob, do you want to go first?
Oh, look at you.
I guess I'll go. I think it would be better to just admit that you're maybe not as rational as you possibly are, because human beings don't actually know that much, even though we may know something. So I think it's better to just be humble in certain situations when that issue comes up.
I think that that's fair, but I also feel like the other option works for when it's more applicable to like different situations. So like if I'm going to rationalize what I'm going to have for dinner, that's just my dinner, but like if I'm going to rationalize what I'm going to be saying in a discussion, like a heated debate about vaccines or whatever we've been, whatever the hot conversation is, then I think that me rationalizing should be said as articulately as possible, that you should be willing to listen to what other people's rationale is, but that if you're going to express what your justification for something is, you should at least be adequately expressing it. And it being adequate would mean that you would be listening to what other people's rationale is. So not just me doing my research and forming an accurate kind of answer to a question, but also that I'm willing to push back against myself to make my opinion stronger. Which I guess still also means that I have to agree with Jacob, right? Like, we still have to admit that our opinion can't 100% be as rational as possible if we're going to avoid questioning it and pushing back. I feel like it makes your argument really weak when you can't listen to the other side and then make your argument better based on what you've heard.
I would add to that I don't think you can be rational without acknowledging your limitations, right? Like, so I don't think it's rational to think that you're absolutely 100% rational. It's rational to be, to be aware of your limitations, but that doesn't mean that everything in the world is opinion, right? As you guys were saying. I mean, so I think the humbleness is an important piece of being aware of the limitations, but then relying on evidence, right? Relying on evidence, realizing that things change, all of those things that we think of as being rational need to be part of the thinking. And so we need to try to combat the fact that we may not always be thinking rationally, and then be humble about it when we are struggling, right? But you also, Safa, said something that was interesting, which is, like, it's a different situation when you're thinking about dinner compared to having an important argument or discussion about something else, right? Even preschoolers can actually distinguish between different types of social situations. So for a long time, it was thought that preschoolers are just totally irrational in pretty much every way. And they are weird. Like, if you interact with preschoolers, they are weird. But they are more rational than they often appear to be. And one of the things we know is that they can actually distinguish between personal sorts of issues versus conventional sorts of issues, like things where there are rules and laws and just ways of being in the group. And they can distinguish those from moral issues. Like, you can ask a preschooler, is it okay for me to shove somebody off of the swings so that they fall onto the ground? And even a preschooler will say no. And then you say, but what if the teacher says it's okay? Even a preschooler will say, no, it's still not okay because the person could get hurt. So, like, they're able to distinguish between something that's governed by rules and laws or personal opinion. They can separate that from something that's a little deeper. So, yeah, I mean, so we're not always rational, but we also have the capacity to be rational. It's both. We're both, and we need to acknowledge both and work at being rational.
That's interesting. I know we're after 5. I want to just, if you pardon me, Professor Matthews, I want to ask you about COVID for a second. Not talking about vaccines or masks specifically, but I'm just talking about how much precaution a particular person exercises. And I feel like a lot of times what happens is that people in a certain camp, I'll put myself in that camp, argue as if our view is facts and there's no emotions associated with the facts. It's like, these are the facts, and therefore I do X because there's a straight line between the facts and my action. But I read somewhere that actually liberals in general tend to be, well, it's actually liberals and conservatives are afraid, but of different things, right? And so the argument was that in many cases, often liberals are there is a middle step from the fact that we just don't notice, which is that, like, we overrate the danger, or some set of people overrate it and other people underrate it, right? So we're like, well, I would never go to a restaurant even if I'm vaccinated and even if I know everyone in there is vaccinated, and someone else, like imagine that person, and then someone else would be like, well, of course I would go. If everyone in there is vaccinated, like there's nothing to worry about. And they have the same access to the data and they respect the data and they both think they're arguing from science, but they're really arguing from what just their fear level is without knowing it. So I'm wondering how, like on that level, not even about biases or whatever, but like, do you think our personalities are like, factor into whenever we're thinking, like, is there such a thing as being objective? I think we tend to think of rationality as paying attention to evidence and therefore as objective. Is that like even possible?
Okay, so I think there's a few different pieces to that. So in terms of fear, in general, conservatives, so this isn't COVID, but in general, conservatives tend to make decisions more based on fear than liberals. But the types of fears are different. Like, so, and then the focus is different. So in terms of people who identify as liberal, they're more likely to make decisions that are for kind of the greater good. But it doesn't mean that conservatives don't care. It's that they're making decisions that are more consistent with protecting their family and their, the smaller group, right? So it's a different focus, and conservatives respond more to fear-based stuff, although that's a little different in COVID, and I haven't read how that plays out. But I think that what I said about kind of the focus of the fear matters, because also there's the fear of having your rights taken away, and that's a very, very big fear for many conservatives. Like a very emotional fear is losing freedom, right? So that's a fear just the same as getting sick. They're different fears, but they're important. And I just think that the focus on individual rights versus the collective is a big difference in terms of how those fears are playing out. So I wouldn't say one group is more fearful than the other group. I would say they're fearful about different things, but I don't know what's been written specifically about that. But I know that, oh my gosh, I compulsively watch the school board meetings for the district that I'm in. I watch them online. I don't go to them. I don't think I'd feel safe going to them, but people get so emotional with what they see as being the facts. I know in my district back in July, parents had to be escorted out of the room by a police officer because they were getting so riled up. We think in the northwest suburbs, right? This should be Florida or something where people are doing that, but people's emotions are so high about their fears about certain things, and everybody is having a hard time with that. Yeah.
Interesting. No, I was just curious because I'd heard like this argument about fear when it comes to liberals and COVID. So what I mean is like, forget the common good part of it for a second, but just the like your perception of how likely you are to get sick.
Yeah.
And that liberals overperceive that we tend to think like, oh my God, if I go into this space, I'm going to die. And conservatives like, you're being insane. Like you're like
going the other direction to being like, I'm going to run around and lick the walls and lick everything you're going to touch, and you're not going to get sick because you're so crazy, right? So it's like going totally different directions, right? In that, so neither side being really tied to the exact set of facts, but then facts are complicated. Science is complicated. When you're talking about people, how do you people and diseases and populations, like how do you distill that into prescriptive rules, right? I mean, it's messy, and when the messier things get, the more people fight about it, I guess, because there's not just a clear answer. Yeah. So one side being more afraid of the getting sick and over exaggerating that, and the other side being afraid about that, but more afraid of their freedoms being taken away. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we're at 5:11, so we should probably wrap up. Any closing questions or anything before we get out of here? Or closing thoughts from you, Professor Matthews?
No, just that there are, if you go online and actually Google cognitive biases or cognitive biases chart or something, you can even click for images, and there's all kinds of charts of them that are like 24 cognitive biases or whatever. Other people have summarized the many, many ways that one of them has 50. I mean, there are so many different ways that our mind tries to process information efficiently. And psychologists have studied these in lots of different settings. Yeah, we mentioned a few. Oh, and confirmation bias is a big one. You always have to look for multiple sources of information. Otherwise, we try to confirm what we already believe. And that's a big, big bias.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Psych 228 currently full, but Professor Matthews is a important fixture in the honors. So hopefully, if you're not seeing her in the spring, you'll see her soon. So, all right, everybody. We hope to see you Friday to tie-dye some masks, Saturday to burn some stuff down, and Monday to pack up some food and help out people in need over the holidays.
Awesome.
Sign up. Do your waivers so Emily doesn't have to keep bothering you. All right.
All right, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Kristen.
Marion and oh, they're too late. Okay. Thanks, Kirsten.